At my family's Thanksgiving dinner, my sister Angela smirked across the mahogany table and asked loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Still using those food stamps, Albina?" Dad nearly choked on his expensive wine while Mom's face turned crimson. The silence was deafening until our butler, Marcus, walked in, carrying tomorrow's Forbes magazine with my face on the cover and the headline, "Meet Tech's Most Secretive Billionaire CEO." Angela's fork clattered to her plate as I smiled and said, "Actually, I bought this house yesterday." The crystal chandelier above us seemed to dim as everyone stared at the magazine in Marcus's gloved hands. My father, Harold, set down his wine glass so hard I thought it might shatter, while my mother, Patricia's perfectly applied lipstick formed a small circle of shock. My older sisters, Angela and Carmen, exchanged bewildered glances, their confidence visibly cracking like ice on a warm spring day. Growing up as the youngest Morrison daughter had taught me that perception often mattered more than reality in our household. Angela, at 32, had built her reputation as a ruthless corporate lawyer, married to Douglas, one of the city's most prominent cardiovascular surgeons. She drove a pearl-white BMW and lived in a glass penthouse overlooking the financial district. Carmen, 30 years old, ran a successful real estate development company and was engaged to city council member Brett Richardson. She favored designer blazers and had never met a networking event she couldn't dominate. Then there was me, 28-year-old Albina, the family disappointment who had somehow managed to stumble through life making all the wrong choices. At least that was the story everyone believed. My parents had built their lives around status and appearances. Harold owned Morrison Regional Banking, a chain of 12 banks across 3 states that had been in our family for 4 generations. Patricia served on the boards of 5 different charitable organizations and hosted elaborate fundraising galas that regularly appeared in the society pages. Their home reflected their values, a sprawling 8,000-square-foot mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood filled with antiques and artwork that spoke of old money and older traditions. The food stamp comment wasn't entirely unfair, though it stung like salt in an open wound. 5 years ago, when I dropped out of Harvard Business School during my junior year, my family had reacted as if I had burned down the family legacy with my own hands. Harold had stormed into my dorm room, his face purple with rage, demanding to know how I could throw away everything they had worked to provide. Patricia had cried for 3 days straight, calling relatives to explain my temporary mental breakdown and assuring them I would come to my senses. But I hadn't come to their version of sense. Instead, I had packed my few belongings into a beat-up Honda Civic and driven west to Silicon Valley with $800 and a dream that everyone told me was impossible. Harold had made his position clear: no family money, no family connections, no family name to trade on. If I wanted to destroy my life, I would do it without any help from the Morrison fortune. Those early months had been brutal in ways my family could never imagine. I worked 3 jobs, cleaning office buildings at night, serving coffee during morning rush hours, and coding freelance projects whenever I could find them. My studio apartment in San Jose was barely 400 square feet and shared a wall with a family whose baby cried every night from midnight to 3 in the morning. Some weeks I genuinely did qualify for food assistance, though I was too proud to actually apply. Angela had visited me exactly once during that period. She had driven up in her BMW wearing a designer coat that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, looked around my tiny apartment with barely concealed disgust, and offered me a check to come home and finish school like a sensible person. When I refused, she had shaken her head sadly and told me I was choosing to be poor out of stubbornness. That conversation had ended our relationship for 2 years. The irony was that my family's rejection had been exactly the motivation I needed. Every rejection letter from potential employers, every late-night coding session, fueled by instant ramen and determination, every small victory that I celebrated alone in my cramped apartment, had brought me closer to something none of them could understand: success on my own terms. Marcus cleared his throat politely, still holding the Forbes magazine like a server presenting fine wine. The butler had worked for our family since before I was born, and his expression remained perfectly neutral despite the chaos unfolding around him. "Shall I place this with the other morning periodicals, Miss Morrison?" he asked, his voice carrying just the slightest hint of amusement. I looked around the table at my family's stunned faces and felt a mixture of vindication and sadness wash over me. For 5 years I had imagined this moment, the revelation, the shock, the satisfying speechlessness of people who had written me off as a failure. But now that it was happening, I realized I felt more empty than triumphant. "No, Marcus," I said quietly. "I think everyone should have a chance to read it." Angela found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "This has to be some kind of mistake. You can't possibly be—" She gestured vaguely at the magazine cover, unable to finish the sentence. Carmen leaned forward, her real estate developer's mind clearly trying to process the implications. "Wait, you said you bought this house? This house specifically?" I nodded, reaching into my purse to pull out a folder of legal documents. The Morrison estate, the vineyard property, and the summer house in the Hamptons. The paperwork was finalized yesterday morning. The sound Patricia made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Harold's face had gone from purple to completely pale, and I could see him doing mental calculations about what this meant for their living situation. "But how is that possible?" Angela demanded, her lawyer instincts kicking in, even as her world tilted off its axis. "You didn't have any money 5 years ago. You were working in coffee shops and living in that horrible little apartment." I had practiced this moment in my mind countless times, but the reality was more complex than any rehearsal could have prepared me for. Looking at their faces, I saw not just shock, but genuine hurt and confusion. For the first time, I wondered if my secrecy had been more about protecting myself than proving a point. The climactic moment arrived as Marcus stepped closer and addressed the entire table. "I should mention the property management company called this morning to confirm that Miss Morrison has acquired the entire Morrison family compound. She is now technically speaking your landlord." The fork that had been trembling in Angela's hand finally completed its journey to the floor, ringing against the marble like a dinner bell. Her eyes rolled back, and she slumped forward in her chair, completely unconscious. As Carmen rushed to help her sister and Patricia frantically called for smelling salts, I sat perfectly still and watched my family's entire understanding of reality crumble around them. The moment I had dreamed about had finally arrived, but it felt nothing like I had imagined it would. The next 10 minutes passed in a blur of chaos as Carmen and Douglas worked to revive Angela, who had never fainted in her entire life. When she finally came around, her first words were, "Tell me that was a stress-induced hallucination." "I'm afraid not," I replied gently, helping myself to another serving of Patricia's famous sweet potato casserole, as if nothing unusual had happened. Though I understand the confusion, it's been a rather eventful few years. Harold had found his voice again, though it sounded strained and unfamiliar. "Albina, I need you to explain this step by step. 5 years ago, you left here with nothing. Now you're telling us you're successful enough to buy properties worth millions of dollars. The mathematics don't work." I set down my fork and looked at each of them in turn. After 5 years of secrecy, the truth felt both liberating and terrifying. "The mathematics work perfectly, Dad. You just don't have all the variables." I began with the algorithm. 3 months after moving to Silicon Valley while working my third job, debugging code for a small financial consulting firm, I had noticed patterns in market behavior that seemed to predict major fluctuations. Not the obvious patterns that every economist could see, but subtle correlations between seemingly unrelated data points, social media sentiment, weather patterns in agricultural regions, shipping container movements, even changes in celebrity social media activity. Working 18 hours a day for 8 months, surviving on energy drinks and determination, I had built an artificial intelligence system that could predict market crashes and surges with 97% accuracy. I called it Quantum Solutions, using my middle name and mother's maiden name to keep it separate from any Morrison family connections. The first test run had been modest, a $10,000 investment based on the AI's prediction of a tech stock surge. When the stock rose exactly as projected, generating a 40% return in 2 weeks, I knew I had created something revolutionary. But I also knew that one success meant nothing without consistent results. Over the following 18 months, I had methodically tested and refined the system, gradually increasing my investment amounts as my confidence grew. The AI evolved, learning from each prediction and becoming more sophisticated with every market cycle. By the end of my second year, Quantum Solutions was managing $50 million in assets and had attracted attention from some very interesting clients. I don't understand. Carmen interrupted her real estate background, making her naturally skeptical of get-rich-quick stories. If you had that kind of success, why didn't we hear anything about it? Why keep living like you were struggling? The answer to that question revealed the more complex part of my story. My clients hadn't been typical investment firms or wealthy individuals looking to grow their portfolios. Instead, Quantum Solutions had attracted attention from Fortune 500 companies facing hostile takeovers, government agencies tracking terrorist financing, and international banks trying to predict currency crashes before they destabilized entire economies. Within 3 years, I was briefing senators about market manipulation schemes, helping the FBI track money laundering operations, and working with the Department of Defense to identify economic warfare attempts by foreign governments. My AI hadn't just made me wealthy, it had made me a strategic asset for national security. The secrecy hadn't been about family drama or personal pride. Federal agencies had required it. My work tracking terrorist financing and international money laundering had made me a target, which meant my identity, my location, and my activities were all classified at levels that required security clearances most people never knew existed. "You're telling us you work for the government?" Patricia asked, her voice barely audible. "I'm telling you I work with multiple agencies when national security interests align with market predictions. My AI can identify funding sources for terrorist organizations 6 months before they execute attacks. It can predict economic warfare attempts 3 weeks before they destabilize currencies. The Department of Homeland Security considers Quantum Solutions essential to financial crime prevention." Douglas, who had been quiet throughout dinner, leaned forward with the analytical mind that made him such a successful surgeon. "That would explain the security protocols. I noticed the men in dark suits watching the house when I arrived tonight." I nodded. "They're always there when I attend family gatherings. Federal Protection Detail. It's been that way for 2 years now, ever since someone tried to kidnap me in San Francisco to access my algorithms." The silence that followed this revelation was different from the shocked quiet earlier. This was the heavy processing silence of people trying to fundamentally reorganize their understanding of someone they thought they knew completely. Angela had recovered enough to engage her lawyer instincts, though she still looked pale and shaken. "If all of this is true, if you really have government protection and billions of dollars, then why have you let us think you were a failure for 5 years? Why endure our judgment and criticism?" That question cut to the heart of everything I had sacrificed and gained, because I needed to know that whatever I built would be mine, not the Morrison family's success, not Dad's banking connections, not Mom's social network, mine. I needed to prove that the person who dropped out of Harvard wasn't giving up on success, but choosing a different definition of it. Carmen was studying me with the calculating expression I remembered from our childhood when she would try to figure out whether I was telling the truth about breaking her favorite doll or eating the last cookie. "This is all very impressive, Albina, but I'm having trouble believing that someone who couldn't afford rent 3 years ago is now wealthy enough to buy our family's entire estate." I had expected this skepticism, and I was prepared for it. Reaching into my purse, I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, then turned the screen toward Carmen. Her eyes widened as she saw account balances with more zeros than she had probably ever imagined. But it was Harold's reaction that surprised me most. Instead of shock or disbelief, his face showed something that looked almost like recognition. "Albina," he said slowly. "About 2 years ago, Morrison Regional received an investment from an anonymous benefactor that saved us from federal investigation. The investor asked for no recognition, no board seats, no public acknowledgement, just enough capital injection to keep us solvent and legitimate. I had wondered when he would figure that out. The investigation was about potential money laundering through agricultural loans. Your AI systems weren't sophisticated enough to catch the patterns that federal regulators had identified. I updated your software, provided the capital for compliance upgrades, and created monitoring systems that ensured you'd never face that kind of scrutiny again." Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. "The Morrison Foundation. Last year, when we almost lost our nonprofit status because of accounting irregularities, someone anonymously provided legal representation and helped us restructure our entire financial system. That someone was me, Mom. I couldn't watch you lose something you cared about because of problems I could solve. The revelation that I had been quietly protecting and supporting my family while they mocked my supposed failures created a new kind of silence around the table. It was the quiet of people realizing they had fundamentally misjudged not just someone's circumstances, but their character." Angela was the first to break her voice cracking with emotion. "You helped us while we treated you like garbage?" Before I could answer, the front door chime rang with the particular melody that indicated an unscheduled but important visitor. Marcus appeared in the dining room doorway with an expression that managed to convey both professionalism and concern. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are federal agents at the door requesting to speak with Miss Morrison. They say it's regarding a security matter." Angela's face went white again. Federal agents. What kind of security matter? I sighed, recognizing the timing of their arrival. The kind that happens when someone runs background checks on classified government assets. "Angela, when you hired that private investigator to look into my finances last month, you triggered multiple federal monitoring systems. They're here because investigating me without proper clearance is considered a potential security breach." The sound Angela made was somewhere between a whimper and a choke. "I hired a private investigator." Carmen stared at her sister in disbelief. "You did what?" As federal agents filed into our family dining room, their presence making everyone except me visibly uncomfortable, I realized that my sister's attempts to prove I was lying about my success had instead proven something entirely different, that she had never really known me at all. The lead agent, a professional woman in her 40s, approached the table with the kind of calm authority that comes from handling sensitive situations regularly. "Miss Morrison, we need to discuss some recent inquiries into your background and assets. It appears someone has been conducting unauthorized investigation into classified financial activities." Angela looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear forever. The sister who had spent 5 years questioning my choices had just learned that questioning them was now a federal crime. Agent Sarah Chen's badge reflected the dining room's soft lighting as she addressed our stunned family gathering. Her partner, Agent Williams, positioned himself near the entrance with the casual alertness of someone trained to handle unexpected situations. The federal presence transformed our holiday dinner into something that felt more like a scene from a political thriller. "Miss Morrison," Agent Chen continued, "we understand that recent background investigations into your activities may have been initiated by family members. While we appreciate that this likely stems from curiosity rather than malicious intent, we need everyone to understand the security implications." Angela found her voice, though it came out smaller and more uncertain than I had ever heard it. "Security implications. I just wanted to understand how my sister suddenly became successful. I hired a private investigator to look into her business activities. That's perfectly legal." Agent Williams stepped forward, his expression remaining neutral but firm. Ma'am, when someone holds the security clearances your sister possesses, unauthorized investigations trigger automatic federal monitoring protocols. The private investigator you hired attempted to access classified financial records and government contractor databases. Harold's banker instincts kicked in, and I could see him trying to process the legal and financial ramifications. Are you saying that Albina's work is classified at levels that make normal background checks illegal? I'm saying that Quantum Solutions operates under contracts that require the highest levels of security clearance, Agent Chen replied. Ms. Morrison's algorithms are considered critical to national economic security. Any unauthorized attempts to access her financial records or business activities are treated as potential threats to national security infrastructure. The weight of this revelation settled over my family like a heavy blanket. Carmen, who had spent her career navigating regulatory requirements in real estate development, understood the implications better than the others. When you say highest levels of security clearance, you mean... I mean that fewer than 50 people in the private sector hold clearances equivalent to your sister's, Agent Williams confirmed. Her work involves predicting and preventing economic attacks that could destabilize the entire American financial system. I had never explained the full scope of my government work because most of it remained classified, but seeing my family's shocked faces made me realize how completely they had misunderstood my life for the past 5 years. The coffee shop jobs and tiny apartment hadn't been evidence of failure. They had been cover for work that required absolute secrecy. 2 years ago, I said quietly, my algorithms predicted an attempt to manipulate currency markets during the G7 summit. Foreign agents were planning to destabilize the dollar through coordinated trading that would have cost American investors approximately $300 billion. My AI identified the pattern 3 weeks before execution, allowing federal agencies to prevent the attack. Patricia's face had gone pale. You prevented an economic attack on the United States. I prevent economic attacks regularly. Currency manipulation, terrorism, financing, money laundering schemes that fund human trafficking. My work isn't just about making money. It's about protecting the financial systems that keep our entire economy functioning. Angela looked like she was going to be sick, and I hired someone to investigate you for fraud. Agent Chen consulted her tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed report. The private investigator you hired, James Morrison of Morrison Investigations, attempted to access federal contractor databases, Treasury Department records, and classified financial intelligence systems. He's currently in federal custody, pending charges related to attempted unauthorized access of government systems. The dining room went silent except for the ticking of my mother's antique grandfather clock. Angela had hired an investigator with the same last name as our family, which meant her attempt to expose my secrets had instead exposed someone potentially connected to us to federal prosecution. Carmen broke the silence with a question that revealed how little any of them had understood about my actual circumstances. If your work is so important and classified, why didn't you tell us? Why let us think you were struggling? Because 3 years ago, I wasn't allowed to tell you. My initial security clearance required that I maintain my cover identity as an unsuccessful college dropout. Federal agencies needed my family to genuinely believe I was failing, so that anyone monitoring our communications would find no evidence of my real activities. Harold leaned back in his chair, looking older than I had ever seen him. You've been lying to us for 3 years on government orders. I've been protecting national security interests while enduring your disappointment and criticism because my country asked me to, and because I believed that proving myself without family connections was worth the personal cost. Agent Chen closed her tablet and looked around the table with professional sympathy. I realize this is a lot of information to process, but there are immediate practical concerns we need to address. Miss Morrison, your family members will need to undergo security screenings if they want to maintain regular contact with you. The unauthorized investigation has flagged them as potential security risks. The implications of this statement hit everyone simultaneously. My success hadn't just changed my status, it had changed theirs. Being my family now came with federal oversight and security requirements that none of them had ever imagined. Before anyone could respond, the front door chime rang again. Marcus appeared with an expression that somehow managed to convey both resignation and slight amusement. "Douglas is here," he announced to Carmen. "He says it's urgent." Douglas burst into the dining room with the frantic energy of someone whose carefully controlled world had just exploded. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his tie askew, and his face flushed with what looked like panic or anger. He stopped short when he saw the federal agents, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. "Douglas," Carmen said carefully, "what's wrong? You look terrible." Her fiancé ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I had never seen from the usually composed city council member. "Carmen, I need to talk to you, privately. There's something I have to tell you, and it can't wait." Agent Chen glanced at me, then at Douglas. "Sir, we're in the middle of a federal security briefing. If this is a personal matter—" "Actually," Douglas said, his voice cracking slightly, "it might be related to your investigation. I've been having an affair, and I just found out that the woman I've been seeing has connections to some very problematic people." The second bombshell of the evening hit the table like lightning. Carmen's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, hurt, and finally, a cold anger that made her look more dangerous than I had ever seen her. "You've been having an affair?" she asked, her voice deadly quiet. "For 6 months." Douglas admitted, unable to meet her eyes. "With Rebecca Thompson from the Planning Commission? But Carmen, there's more. She's been asking me questions about your construction projects, about city permits, about federal compliance issues. I think she was using me to get information about your business." Angela, who had been sitting in stunned silence since learning about the federal investigation, suddenly straightened in her chair. "Rebecca Thompson. The same Rebecca Thompson who handles municipal bond oversight?" Douglas nodded miserably. "Carmen, I think your real estate projects might be under investigation. Rebecca was asking very specific questions about your federal tax filings and construction permits, questions that only someone conducting an official investigation would know to ask." Agent Williams stepped forward, his expression alert and focused. "Sir, are you suggesting that Miss Morrison's fiancé has been sharing information about construction projects with someone who might be conducting an unauthorized investigation?" The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as everyone realized that Douglas's confession had just implicated Carmen in whatever federal security concerns had brought the agents to our dinner in the first place. Carmen's face had gone from angry to terrified in the span of 30 seconds. "Douglas, what exactly did you tell Rebecca about my business?" "Everything," he whispered. "Project locations, financial backing, permit, applications, tax structures. She said she was helping me understand municipal development so I could be more effective on the city council." Agent Chen and Agent Williams exchanged glances that spoke of years of partnership and shared experience with complicated situations. I could practically see them mentally reassigning this from a simple, unauthorized investigation case to something much more complex and potentially serious. "Miss Morrison," Agent Chen said to Carmen, "we're going to need to examine your business records immediately. If federal investigators are looking into your construction projects through unofficial channels, there may be serious compliance issues we need to address." As my family's Thanksgiving dinner transformed into what appeared to be the beginning of a federal investigation into multiple members of my immediate family, I sat quietly and realized that my 5 years of secrecy had protected not just my own security clearance, but potentially my relatives from scrutiny that might have revealed problems I had never known existed. The moment I had dreamed of when my family would finally understand my success had become the moment when their own secrets began to unravel in the most dangerous possible way. Angela's husband, Douglas, chose that moment to make an entrance that would have been dramatic under normal circumstances, but now seemed almost surreal. He walked into the dining room, took one look at the federal agents, and went completely rigid. "Angela," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, "we need to talk now." My sister Angela looked up at her husband with the kind of wariness that comes from sensing approaching disaster. "Douglas, this really isn't a good time. We're in the middle of something rather significant here." "So am I," he replied grimly. "Angela, I want a divorce." The words dropped into our already chaotic dinner like a grenade into a powder keg. Angela's face went through several expressions before settling on something between disbelief and rage. "You want a what?" "I've been having an affair with my research assistant and I can't continue living this lie. I'm filing papers tomorrow morning." Agent Chen looked like she was beginning to regret accepting this assignment. "Sir, while family matters are certainly important, we're in the middle of a federal security briefing." Douglas turned to the agent with wild eyes. "That's exactly why I can't wait. Angela has been doing things that could implicate me in criminal activity. I need to establish legal distance immediately." This accusation hit Angela like cold water. She stood up so fast her chair nearly toppled backward. "Criminal activity, Douglas. What are you talking about?" "The embezzlement, Angela. I know about the client trust fund money you've been moving through our joint accounts. I know about the gambling debts and the falsified billing records. I can't be connected to that when it comes to light." The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when everyone in a room realizes they're witnessing something that will change everything forever. Angela's face had gone from flushed to completely white, and she was gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "I don't know what you think you know," she said carefully, "but you're completely wrong about everything." Agent Williams stepped forward, his professional instincts clearly activated by the mention of embezzlement and falsified records. "Ma'am, are you saying there are no irregularities in your financial records?" Before Angela could answer, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and her face somehow managed to become even paler. "It's the managing partner of my law firm on Thanksgiving night." She answered with a shaking hand. "Hello, Richard. Yes, I know it's a holiday." Her voice became smaller with each response. "What do you mean the accounts don't balance? What missing money?" Long pause. "How much money are we talking about?" Another pause, and then Angela made a sound like she had been punched in the stomach. $300,000. She hung up and looked around the table at all of us staring at her. "I think I need to call my lawyer." Carmen laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You are a lawyer, Angela." "I need to call a different lawyer." Agent Chen consulted her tablet again, typing rapidly. "Miss Morrison, I'm going to need you to remain available for questioning regarding both the unauthorized investigation into your sister's activities and now potential financial crimes that may have federal implications if they involve interstate banking or electronic funds transfer." Harold's face had gone gray, and I could see him mentally calculating the damage that Angela's legal problems might do to the family's reputation and his banking business. "Angela, please tell me you haven't been moving client funds through Morrison regional accounts." The look on Angela's face answered his question before her words did. "Just temporarily, just to cover some cash flow issues until I could replace what I borrowed. It was never meant to be permanent." Patricia stood up abruptly, her hands shaking. "I need some air. This is too much. First Albina's revelations, then federal agents, now embezzlement and divorce. I can't process all of this at once." As she headed toward the back patio, Carmen called after her. "Mom, wait. There's something I need to tell everyone, too." Patricia stopped in the doorway, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "Carmen, please tell me you don't have federal agents investigating you, too." "Not federal agents exactly, but there is an IRS audit that I haven't mentioned, and some questions about construction permits that might involve bribery charges." The dining room fell silent again, except for the sound of Harold's breathing becoming increasingly labored. I was beginning to worry about his blood pressure and wondering if we needed to call his cardiologist. Agent Williams looked at his partner with an expression that clearly communicated they had walked into something much more complicated than a simple unauthorized background check. "Miss Morrison," he said to Carmen, "are you saying that you're under federal investigation for tax evasion and bribery?" "I'm saying that some of my business practices might not have been entirely compliant with federal regulations, and that certain permit approvals might have involved payments that could be misinterpreted as bribes rather than legitimate consulting fees." Douglas, who had been quiet since dropping his divorce bombshell, suddenly looked panicked again. "Carmen, does this involve the Richardson Municipal Development Project? Because my position on the City Council could be compromised if there are bribery allegations connected to projects I voted to approve." Carmen stared at her future brother-in-law with growing horror. "Douglas, you voted to approve my permits because they were good projects that met all municipal requirements, right?" "I voted to approve them because Angela told me they were family projects and it would be a good way to support you financially." The confession hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was rapidly getting out of control. Carmen's construction business, Angela's law practice, Douglas's city council position, and even Harold's banking operations were all potentially connected to a web of questionable practices that federal investigators would now be examining with microscopes. I sat quietly throughout these revelations, processing the fact that while I had been building a legitimate business empire under federal protection, my entire family had been engaging in various forms of financial misconduct that could destroy everything they had worked to build. Agent Chen's phone buzzed, and she answered it with the crisp professionalism of someone accustomed to complicated situations becoming more complicated. "Yes, sir. Yes, we're at the location now. Multiple family members, yes. Financial crimes, potential bribery, and possible municipal corruption." She listened for several moments, then looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. "Sir, I think we're going to need additional units." As she hung up, Marcus appeared in the doorway again, this time carrying an overnight bag and looking uncharacteristically flustered. "Miss Morrison, I've taken the liberty of packing some essentials. There are several unmarked vehicles approaching the property, and I believe this evening's festivities may be concluding earlier than anticipated." Agent Williams looked out the window and confirmed Marcus's observation. "Federal agents from multiple departments. This is officially a multi-agency investigation now." Angela began crying, the kind of desperate sobbing that comes from realizing that your entire life is about to change in ways you never imagined. Carmen was staring at her phone, probably calculating how much money she would need for legal defense. Harold was clutching his chest, and Patricia had returned from her attempted escape to the patio to find even more chaos than when she had left. In the middle of this familial meltdown, my phone rang. I answered it, calmly listened for 30 seconds, then hung up and looked around the table at my devastated family. That was my head of security. He's been monitoring federal law enforcement communications tonight, and I now have a complete picture of what's been happening. Angela, Carmen, Douglas, and even Dad, you're all under federal investigation for different but related crimes. The private investigator Angela hired discovered evidence of your activities and reported them to federal authorities as part of a plea agreement to avoid charges for attempting to access my classified records. The room went completely silent as the full scope of their situation became clear. My successful evening of revelation had become their night of reckoning, and federal agents were about to arrest multiple members of my immediate family. As car doors slammed outside and official voices could be heard approaching the front door, I realized that my 5 years of protecting national security had prepared me for many types of crises, but none of my classified training had taught me how to handle watching my family's entire world collapse on Thanksgiving dinner. The next hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed disaster. Additional federal agents filled our dining room, transforming my family's holiday gathering into something resembling a law enforcement convention. Agent Chen had been joined by colleagues from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the FBI's white-collar crime unit, and what appeared to be representatives from the Department of Justice's Public Corruption Section. My father, Harold, sat motionless in his chair, staring at the official badges and identification cards being displayed around our table. The man who had built a regional banking empire through 4 generations of careful family stewardship was watching that legacy crumble in real time. Patricia had stopped crying and entered a state of shock that made her appear almost catatonic. Angela's phone had been ringing continuously until Agent Rodriguez from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit asked her to turn it off. "Ma'am, communications with outside parties need to be suspended until we can determine the scope of this investigation." She explained with professional courtesy that somehow made the situation feel even more surreal. Carmen had found her voice again, though it came out strained and desperate. "I need to understand something. Are we under arrest right now? Because if we are, I want to call my attorney before anyone asks any more questions." Agent Williams consulted his tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be detailed case files. "Miss Morrison, you're not under arrest at this moment, but that status could change rapidly depending on how cooperative you choose to be with our investigation." "What does cooperation look like exactly?" Carmen asked, her real estate developer's instincts kicking in even under these circumstances. "It looks like full disclosure of all financial records, business partnerships, government contracts, permit applications, and any payments made to municipal officials over the past 5 years," Agent Chen replied. "It looks like complete honesty about business practices that may have violated federal law." Douglas had been unusually quiet since his divorce announcement, but he suddenly spoke up with the kind of panicked clarity that comes from realizing you're about to lose everything. "I want to cooperate fully. Whatever Angela and Carmen have done, I was manipulated into participating. I had no knowledge that my city council votes were connected to criminal activity." Angela spun around to face her husband with fury that cut through her fear. "You're throwing me under the bus to protect your political career. I'm protecting myself from going to prison for things I didn't know were crimes when I did them," he shot back. "You told me that supporting Carmen's projects was family loyalty, not municipal corruption." Agent Rodriguez stepped between them with the practiced ease of someone who had mediated countless domestic disputes that occurred during financial crime investigations. "Let's focus on gathering information rather than assigning blame. We need to understand the timeline and scope of activities before we can determine appropriate charges." I had remained quiet throughout most of these exchanges, watching my family implode while processing my own complicated emotions about their situation. On one hand, I felt vindicated that their years of criticism had been rooted in their own moral compromises. On the other hand, watching people you love face federal prosecution was more painful than I had anticipated. My phone buzzed with a text message from my head of security. I read it quickly, then looked up at Agent Chen. "I need to share something that might affect your investigation timeline." She nodded for me to continue. "My security team has been monitoring communications related to my family since the unauthorized background investigation began. We've identified additional evidence of financial crimes that extends beyond what you've discovered so far." Harold's head snapped up and he stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "Albina, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that when federal agencies gave me security clearance, they conducted thorough background investigations of everyone in my immediate family. I've known about Angela's client trust fund irregularities for 8 months. I've known about Carmen's permit bribery for 6 months. I've known about the connections between their activities and Dad's banking operations for 4 months." The silence that followed this revelation was different from all the previous silences of the evening. This was the quiet of people realizing that someone they had underestimated had been several steps ahead of them the entire time. Angela found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You've known about everything we were doing, and you just watched us dig ourselves deeper into legal trouble. I've been gathering evidence and preparing for this moment since my security clearance required me to report potential criminal activities involving family members." Carmen's face showed a mixture of betrayal and growing understanding. "You've been building a case against us." "I've been protecting national security interests while trying to find a way to help my family before their poor choices destroyed them completely. Tonight was supposed to be an intervention, not an arrest. Agent Chen looked at me with new interest. Miss Morrison, are you saying you have additional evidence relevant to our investigation? I nodded and pulled out my phone, opening an encrypted app that contained months of carefully documented communications and financial records. I have recordings of Angela discussing her client fund transfers. I have copies of Carmen's actual payments to municipal officials. I have evidence of their coordination through family banking accounts. I've been building a complete picture of their activities because I hope to convince them to seek legal counsel and make restitution before federal agencies discovered the problems independently. Patricia finally spoke, her voice hollow and distant. You've been spying on us. I've been trying to save you from yourselves. My security clearance requires me to report criminal activities, but it doesn't prevent me from trying to help family members correct their mistakes before those mistakes become federal cases. Harold leaned forward, his banking experience helping him understand the implications of what I was saying. Albina, are you offering to help us cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges? I'm offering you a choice. You can face whatever charges federal agencies decide to file based on their independent investigation, or you can accept my conditions for receiving the legal and financial support that might keep you out of federal prison. The room went quiet except for the sound of official conversations happening in adjacent rooms as agents continued their investigation. My family members looked at each other, then at the federal agents, then back at me, clearly trying to process the idea that their despised youngest sister had somehow become their potential salvation. Agent Williams stepped forward with professional curiosity. Miss Morrison, what kind of conditions are we talking about? Complete financial restitution to all affected parties, cooperation with federal investigations, resignation from positions that enabled criminal activity, family counseling to address the underlying issues that led to these poor choices, community service appropriate to the harm they've caused, and public acknowledgement of their mistakes. Angela's response came out sharper than I think she intended. You want us to publicly humiliate ourselves as a condition for your help. I want you to take responsibility for your actions and demonstrate genuine remorse for the people you've harmed. If that feels like humiliation, maybe you should examine why accountability feels shameful to you. Douglas had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but he suddenly looked up with something approaching hope. If we agree to your conditions and cooperate fully with federal investigators, what kind of legal protection are we talking about? The kind that comes from having the best legal defense team money can buy restitution funds that eliminate financial motives for prosecution and character references from someone who works closely with multiple federal agencies. Agent Chen consulted her tablet again, then looked at her colleagues before addressing all of us. This is unusual but not unprecedented. Federal prosecutors often prefer cooperation and restitution over lengthy criminal trials, especially when the defendants demonstrate genuine remorse and make complete financial reparations. Carmen leaned back in her chair, the fight seeming to drain out of her. What happens if we refuse your conditions? Then you face federal prosecution without my assistance, and I testify as a witness to whatever criminal activities I've documented over the past 8 months. The choice I was offering them was stark, but fair: accept accountability and receive help, or maintain their pride and face the consequences alone. As I looked around the table at their faces, I realized that this moment would define not just their legal futures, but the possibility of rebuilding our relationships on foundations of honesty rather than pretense. The sound of additional vehicles arriving outside suggested that their time to decide was running out, and whatever choice they made would have to happen quickly. Agent Chen's radio crackled with a message that made everyone in the room tense. Base to Unit 7, we have arrest warrants ready for processing, awaiting your signal for suspect detention. Angela's face went completely white. Arrest warrants for all of us. Agent Williams nodded grimly. Based on the evidence we've gathered tonight, federal prosecutors have authorized charges for embezzlement, bribery, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Unless circumstances change significantly in the next few minutes, we'll be taking several of you into custody. I stood up from the table, feeling the weight of months of preparation and difficult decisions settling on my shoulders. Agent Chen, I'd like to present my family with my formal offer before any arrests are made. They deserve to understand their options completely. She consulted her watch and nodded. You have 10 minutes before we execute the warrants. I looked around the table at my parents and sisters, seeing not the successful, confident people who had criticized my choices for 5 years, but frightened individuals facing the collapse of everything they had built through compromised ethics and poor judgment. Here are my conditions. I began, my voice steady despite the emotional complexity of the moment. First, Angela must make full restitution of all embezzled funds within 30 days. $300,000 plus interest returned to every client account you've touched. You'll also surrender your law license voluntarily and accept whatever disciplinary action the State Bar Association deems appropriate. Angela opened her mouth to protest, but I continued before she could speak. Second, Carmen must pay full restitution to every municipal official you've bribed, plus penalties equivalent to double the amount of inappropriate payments made. You'll restructure your construction business to operate entirely within federal regulations, with independent oversight for the next 5 years. All future projects will be subject to third-party compliance monitoring. Carmen's hands were shaking, but she nodded slowly. Third, Douglas must resign from the City Council immediately and publicly disclose the conflict of interest created by your family relationships. You'll cooperate fully with any investigation into municipal corruption and accept whatever legal consequences result from votes that may have been influenced by personal relationships rather than public interest. Douglas looked like he wanted to argue, but one glance at the federal agents surrounding us seemed to change his mind. Fourth, Dad, you must restructure Morrison Regional Banking to eliminate any accounts or services that facilitated family members' questionable activities. 50% of the bank's ownership will be transferred to an employee profit-sharing program to demonstrate your commitment to ethical business practices. Harold's face showed the pain of someone watching a family legacy transform before his eyes, but he also looked relieved to have a path forward that didn't involve federal prosecution. Fifth, Mom, you'll step down from all charity board positions and spend the next year working directly with beneficiary populations to understand the actual impact of the organizations you've been leading from boardroom tables. Patricia nodded, tears starting to flow again, but these seemed different from her earlier panic. These looked more like tears of recognition and perhaps relief. Finally, all of you will participate in family counseling for 1 year to address the ethical failures and communication breakdowns that led to these problems. You'll also complete community service hours, appropriate to the crimes you've committed, working directly with populations harmed by financial crimes like yours. Agent Rodriguez had been taking notes throughout my presentation, and she looked up with professional interest. Miss Morrison, what kind of legal representation are you offering to provide the best criminal defense team in the country restitution funds sufficient to eliminate financial motivation for prosecution, and my personal testimony regarding their character and willingness to make amends, plus ongoing financial support for their families during the transition period when their earning capacity may be reduced? Angela finally found her voice. Why would you do this for us after how we've treated you? The question cut to the heart of everything I had struggled with over the past 5 years. Because you're my family, and family means choosing love over revenge, even when revenge feels more satisfying in the moment. Carmen leaned forward, her developer's mind working through the practical implications. What guarantee do we have that accepting your conditions will actually protect us from federal prosecution? Agent Chen stepped in to answer this question. Federal prosecutors strongly prefer cooperation and restitution over costly trials, especially in cases where defendants demonstrate genuine remorse and make complete financial reparations. While I can't guarantee specific outcomes, cooperation agreements combined with full restitution typically result in significantly reduced charges or alternative sentencing arrangements. Douglas had been quiet during most of this exchange, but he suddenly spoke up with desperate urgency. "What happens to our marriage, Angela? If I resign from the city council and you surrender your law license, how do we rebuild our lives?" Angela looked at her husband with an expression that seemed to contain 5 years' worth of suppressed emotions. "I don't know, Douglas. I'm not even sure I want to rebuild a life with someone who would announce he wants a divorce in the middle of a federal investigation." "I was panicking," he said weakly. "I was scared and trying to protect myself. And I was scared and trying to hide my mistakes from everyone I cared about," she replied. "Maybe we both need to learn how to handle fear without abandoning the people who should matter most to us." Patricia had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but she suddenly looked up with a question that surprised everyone. "Albina, if we accept your conditions and avoid federal prison, what happens to our relationships? Do you forgive us for 5 years of criticism and judgment? Do we just pretend that none of this happened?" Her question revealed the emotional complexity beneath all the legal and financial negotiations. "Mom, I can't pretend that 5 years of family rejection didn't hurt me deeply, but I also can't pretend that watching you face federal prosecution doesn't hurt me just as much. Forgiveness isn't about pretending harmful things didn't happen. It's about choosing healing over continued pain." Harold spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that fundamental changes were inevitable. "If we accept your conditions, Albina, what kind of family do you envision us becoming?" "I envision us becoming a family that tells each other the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. I envision us becoming people who support each other's actual success, rather than criticizing each other's apparent failures. I envision us becoming a family that uses whatever privilege and resources we have to help other people, rather than just protecting our own status." Agent Williams' radio crackled again. "Unit 7, we need a status update on warrant execution. Prosecutors are asking for timeline confirmation." Agent Chen looked around the table at all of us. "I need decisions now. Are you accepting Miss Morrison's offer and agreeing to cooperation, or are we proceeding with arrests?" The moment of choice had arrived, and I could see my family members looking at each other, conducting silent conversations through expressions and glances. Years of complicated relationships, months of hidden criminal activity, and a single evening of devastating revelations had led to this binary decision: accountability with support or pride with consequences. Angela was the first to speak. "I accept your conditions, Albina. All of them." Carmen nodded. "I accept too." Douglas hesitated for a moment, then said quietly, "I accept." Harold looked at Patricia, and they seemed to communicate something wordlessly before he turned to me. "We accept your conditions, sweetheart. All of them." As federal agents began making phone calls to prosecutors, and my family members started the process of choosing cooperation over concealment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 5 years, the possibility that our relationships might be rebuilt on foundations stronger than shared genetics and social expectations. The evening that had begun with my sister mocking my apparent poverty had ended with my family accepting accountability for actual crimes, and somehow that felt like the beginning of something better than anything we had shared before. 6 months later, I stood in the same dining room where my family's world had imploded on Thanksgiving night, watching Marcus arrange flowers for what had become our monthly family dinner. These gatherings bore little resemblance to the formal, status-conscious affairs of my childhood. The conversation was honest, the atmosphere was warm, and nobody felt the need to perform success for each other. Angela arrived first looking healthier than I had seen her in years. The stress lines around her eyes had softened, and she carried herself with a different kind of confidence than the brittle professional armor she had worn as a corporate lawyer. Her marriage to Douglas had survived, though it had required months of counseling and fundamental changes in how they communicated about everything from money to career ambitions. "The public defender's office is actually amazing," she told me as we sat together in the kitchen while Marcus finished dinner preparations. I'm working with clients who genuinely need legal advocacy, rather than just trying to maximize billable hours for corporate clients who can afford to pay for legal manipulation. It feels like practicing law the way I originally imagined it might feel. Her restitution had been completed on schedule, though it had required selling their penthouse and most of their luxury possessions. Douglas had found work as a cardiovascular surgeon at a public hospital after resigning from the city council, and they were renting a modest 2-bedroom apartment while rebuilding their lives on foundations of actual service rather than social status. "Do you miss the money?" I asked, genuinely curious about how someone accustomed to wealth adjusted to financial constraints. She considered the question seriously before answering. "I miss the security that money provided, but I don't miss the pressure to maintain appearances or the constant worry about whether people liked me for myself or for what I could do for them. Living more simply has been surprisingly liberating." Carmen arrived with her fiancé, Brett, who had also resigned from the city council and was now working as a community organizer focusing on affordable housing development. Carmen's construction company had been restructured completely with independent oversight and a mission focused on building homes for low-income families rather than luxury developments for wealthy clients. "The affordable housing project broke ground last week," Carmen announced as she hugged me. 60 units for families transitioning out of homelessness, built with union labor and designed to be energy efficient and sustainable. It's the most meaningful work I've ever done. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I could see how much more satisfied she was building homes for people who genuinely needed them, rather than creating investment properties for people who already had more than they could use. Our parents arrived together, though they looked older than they had 6 months ago. The stress of federal investigation and fundamental life changes had taken a visible toll, but there was something peaceful in their expressions that I hadn't seen during my childhood. Harold had restructured Morrison Regional Banking exactly as agreed, transferring 50% ownership to employees and implementing ethical lending practices that prioritized community development over profit maximization. "The employee ownership model has actually improved our performance," he told us over dinner. "When people have a stake in the organization's success, they work harder and make better decisions." Patricia had stepped down from all her charity board positions and was working directly with homeless populations through a local shelter. "I spent 20 years attending fundraising galas and board meetings, thinking I understood poverty because I could write checks to address it," she said. "Actually working with people experiencing homelessness has taught me more about effective charity in 6 months than I learned in 20 years of committee meetings. The most significant change was in how we talked to each other. The performance aspects of our previous relationships had disappeared, replaced by conversations about genuine challenges, authentic emotions, and real support for each other's growth, rather than judgment about each other's choices." During dinner, Angela brought up something that had been weighing on her mind: Albina. "I need to apologize for something specific that I don't think I've fully addressed. When I hired that private investigator, I wasn't just curious about your success. I was hoping to find evidence that you had achieved it through questionable means, so I could feel better about my own moral compromises." Her honesty was both painful and healing. "I wanted you to be successful through the same kinds of ethical shortcuts I had been taking, so I wouldn't have to face the fact that I had been choosing the easy, corrupt path while you were doing the hard work of building something legitimate." Carmen nodded in agreement. I think we all assumed that significant success required moral compromise, because that's how we had been achieving our smaller successes. The idea that you could build a billion-dollar company while maintaining ethical standards challenged our entire worldview. Patricia reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "We criticized you for dropping out of business school because it threatened our belief that following traditional paths guaranteed success. When those traditional paths led us into criminal activity, we had to confront the possibility that you had been right to choose a different approach." Harold's contribution to this conversation revealed how much his own thinking had changed. 4 generations of Morrison men built this banking business by prioritizing profit over community impact. I taught my daughters that success meant accumulating wealth and status rather than creating value for other people. Your approach to business forced me to examine whether our family legacy was actually something worth preserving. These conversations were part of our weekly family counseling sessions, but they had begun happening naturally during our monthly dinners as well. The process of rebuilding our relationships required ongoing honesty about past mistakes and current challenges. "There's something I want to share with all of you," I said, setting down my fork and looking around the table. Forbes is doing a follow-up article about my company and my family background. They want to explore how family relationships affect entrepreneurial success. Angela looked concerned. "Are you planning to discuss what happened with our legal problems?" "I'm planning to discuss how success means nothing without people you love to share it with, and how real strength sometimes means using your power to heal relationships rather than win arguments." The article would be published next month, featuring interviews with our entire family about business ethics, family dynamics, and the relationship between personal integrity and professional success. My quote would conclude, "The peace. The hardest algorithm to solve was forgiveness, but it yielded the highest return on investment, a family that finally knows how to love." As we finished dinner and prepared to spend the evening playing board games and sharing stories about our work, I reflected on how completely our relationships had transformed. The family that had once criticized my choices while hiding their own moral failures had become a family that supported each other's growth while maintaining accountability for past mistakes. The success I had achieved through 5 years of secrecy and sacrifice had ultimately been meaningless until I could share it with people who knew me completely and loved me anyway. My government contracts and billion-dollar valuations had made me wealthy and professionally fulfilled, but rebuilding my family relationships had made me genuinely happy. 6 months ago, my sister had mocked me for using food stamps while I secretly owned the house we were eating in. Tonight, that same sister was thanking me for helping her discover work that aligned with her values rather than just her financial ambitions. The journey from that moment of revelation to this moment of genuine connection had taught all of us that true success isn't about proving yourself to people who doubt you. It's about becoming someone worthy of the trust placed in you by people who choose to love you despite your flaws. As I looked around the table at my family's faces, I realized that the algorithm I had developed for predicting market behavior had been less important than learning to predict human behavior. The most valuable lesson from my 5 years of building a secret business empire wasn't about artificial intelligence or financial markets. It was about the intelligence required to maintain relationships and the market value of forgiveness in a world that often prioritizes being right over being kind. The evening ended with everyone helping Marcus clean up, sharing plans for next month's gathering, and exchanging hugs that felt genuine rather than obligatory. As I watched my family members drive away in their more modest cars to their smaller homes, I felt wealthier than any bank account or stock portfolio could make me feel. My story had begun with a sister's cruel comment about food stamps and my dramatic revelation of hidden success, but the real story had been about learning that wealth without relationships is poverty, that success without love is failure, and that the most important algorithm any of us can master is the one that calculates the value of choosing healing over hurt. Have you ever had to choose between proving you were right and preserving a relationship with someone you loved? I'd love to hear about your experiences with family dynamics and forgiveness in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more stories about second chances and family healing, and share it with anyone who might need a reminder that it's possible to rebuild relationships even after they seem completely broken. Thank you for listening, and I hope your own family relationships are filled with the kind of honest love that makes every other success meaningful.